Hello. Little delayed entry there. How are you? How are you? Unfortunately, I don't have anybody else to say hi to today. Simon is off as an organizer for DroidCon London, so he's having a wonderful time there. Majid is working on putting together Flutter Vikings. Randall's feeling a little shy, but he is out there in the chat, which leaves me to do the original introductions here. But don't worry, I will be passing this off to a whole crew of wonderful people shortly. So let's see here. Let's take a quick look first at our do's and don'ts. So do be respectful and constructive even while on YouTube comments. Don't post anything that's adult, rude, offensive statements. Don't advertise or promote anything. Don't spam, which that specifically does mean don't keep posting your same question over and over again. It's a good way to get it ignored. And harassment of any kind is not tolerated. Not only do people get kicked from here for that kind of harassment, but we do share the ban lists with all of the other Flutter community people out there, such as, the Flutter community Slack and many others. So let's see here. With that, we do also have coming up a review of all the things Flutter community does have to offer you and our Patreon. So just in case you need other resources, they are there. And with that, let's bring Danielle on so she can talk to you more about what you're really here for.
Hey, Scott, thank you very much for the intro there. And you're going to be back up a little bit later. So
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah, well, we will see you in a little bit. All right, great. And can you bring up my co-host for the day, Sarah?
Hi.
Hi, Sarah. How are you doing?
Good. Good to be here.
That's great. And hopefully next week we'll be able to have Esra back with us. But in the meantime, you're jumping on. And then we also have another co-host / she was the tech editor on the book, so she's very important to this whole thing. Steph, can you come on stage, Steph?
Steph? Oh. I don't see her in the. We lost Steph. All right. Well, we'll bring her on.
Steph seems to have dropped off. She'll be back with us later. Absolutely. So what are we doing today, Sarah?
Well, we have a lot of content to cover today. We are going to learn about scrolling widgets and then get an introduction to state management with Provider and learn about how use interactive widgets. Craig is going to tell you a lot more about that, but that's just a big picture overview.
That sounds great. And Sarah, I think you've got a couple of slides to show us.
I do. Sure. So I will add it to.
All right, here we are on week 3 of the Flutter Apprentice Book Club. And we're covering more widgets and the intro to state management. And like Sarah said, Craig is going to do a great job with this. And all right, why don't you show us the credits page? There we go.
Yeah.
And all right, so we've got Randall, who's basically question moderating. He's also the one that is backstage, making sure things go well on the YouTube chat. So if you're asking questions, that's a good thing. And Sarah, how should people be asking questions?
Good question. We are kindly asking that you put a Q or a question mark before your question so that in the long stream of live chat, it's easier for us to identify them so we can more easily put your questions in the queue. So
great. Okay, the next person we have on here is Stef Patterson, and she's here with us. So why don't you come up on stage?
Hi.
Steph, why are you here on this, besides being a Flutter expert yourself?
I am here for 2 things. I am the technical editor for Flutter Apprentice, and I'm also one of the co-managers for the Flutteristas with Danielle and Sarah and a few other people.
and Esra, our normal co-host, so she's also one like that. So great. Okay, good. And then we've got Simon. Everybody that knows Flutter community is going to know Simon. If this is your first time here, you'll get to know and love him later. He's he's everybody's resident expert in all things Flutter. And I'm here. I'm also one of the organizers of the Flutteristas, which we can talk about at some point coming up. Backstage right now, we've got Scott. You saw him just a few minutes ago. So when you hear me calling for stuff, that's Scott. He's producer extraordinaire today. We've got Craig, who is he's our DevRel expert, and so he's actually the one that's going to be doing the coding along live coding, so that you can get a feel for how things are going. And then we've got Sarah. Why don't you say hi, Sarah? You've already been on stage, but say hi.
Hi, I'm helping with community management with the Flutter DevRel team as well.
All right, so you're basically our Neeli for this, right?
I am your Neeli today, yes.
Okay, perfect. And I think that's the last slide we have, right?
Yes, that's it. So we can just
remove
it.
That's perfect. All right, and once again, I want to repeat that as it comes up and you come up with questions, put a Q in front of the question, and that helps us find it better. And that's how we will do it. So last week we started learning about basic widgets and some theory. And today we're going to dive deeper into all the cool things you can do with widgets. And so, Craig, if you're ready, the stage is all yours.
Oh,
wait, hold on. Before let's not bring Craig up yet. What's up, Sarah?
I have one more thing I want to share, which is the community resources, because Craig is about to share a lot of material and you might have some questions. So I just want to provide some resources for people to know where they can ask for help. So let me just pull that up. There it is. Someone put it up. Awesome. So one of the great things about the Flutter community is that there are so many amazing, nice people out there that just want to help you learn Flutter. So first of all, we have the Flutter Meetup Network, which is over 100 meetups around the world full of passionate and kind organizers and members. And if there's one near you, you can join it, or even if there isn't, a lot of them have online events and associated Slack groups and so on. So I do recommend reaching out to one of your local groups and joining or just attending some events. And there you will find people that I'm quite certain will be happy to help you if you are getting a little stuck on something. But if that's not your thing, then we also have a lot of online resources. There is the Ray Wenderlich book forum. So if you got Flutter Apprentice, then you have access to this forum. The link should be in the show notes. And it's just full of people that are reading the book with you. So that's a great place to go. There's also Stack Overflow. There's a lot of really good questions that have been answered there, and you can ask new questions. Helpful people answering there all the time. The Flutter Dev Reddit is also a good place to ask questions, as well as the Flutter Community Slack, and of course, the Flutter Discord. And oh my gosh, someone is renovating their kitchen upstairs. Last but not least, there's here, where every week we will answer your questions live. So hope we can help you out. All right, that's it.
One thing I want to mention about Hump Day Q&A is right now we've taken it over for the Flutter Book Club, the Flutter Apprentice Book Club, but it's here every week. So yes. So even after we're done with the book club, you can still come to Hump Day Q&A. It's a great place to get your questions answered.
Okay, and now without further ado, I'd like to bring on Craig, who will tell us about first scrolling widgets, and then we'll do some Q&A after that.
Sure, and we were doing some practicing backstage, and it looks like Craig's audio is a little bit quiet. We'll try to get that fixed for you now, but for right now, if it's quiet, you're gonna have to turn up your volume. Sorry about that. And now, without further ado, Craig, will you please take it away?
All right, everyone, welcome back to week 3, chapter 5 of the Flutter Apprentice Book Club. I don't know about you, but chapter 5, things are starting to get pretty interesting, I thought. Scrolling, obviously, the main topic in chapter 5, if you've already done the reading. If not, as always, this could be a bit of a primer for you to catch up and do the reading later. watching this first is, no problem at all. It'll probably make chapter 5 a breeze when you actually get to it. Anyway, my name's Craig Labenz, and welcome back. Let's get into it. I'm gonna be able to click on the right thing. Okay, here we go. So chapter 5, scrollable widgets. We're going to be talking about list view and grid view. Also making a stop on future builder with asynchrony. If you saw, a couple of us were tweeting a link to an old series on YouTube from the Flutter team about asynchrony in Dart, and it's a 5-parter, take you about a half an hour to get through it, and that'll really set you up nicely to also understand things like future builder and then later on stream builder. We've got future builder in this episode, so we thought it was a good time to start hinting at all of that. But the main characters today are list view and grid view and their ability to help your apps get scrolling. So list view we have on the left here, and this is a very common pattern. We've used it already before in the Picture of the Day app, but just kind of glossed over exactly what it was doing. It's similar to column and row in that it arranges its children in a linear manner. And it's similar to a row, of course, if you tell it to go left or right. It's similar to a column if you leave it in its default state of top down. And the difference, though, Mary Poppins bag or something. I don't know. I haven't seen Mary Poppins, if that's the name of the movie. But I think she has like a magic bag or something. So it's bigger on the inside than on the outside. And there's a widget deep inside list view called viewport. And this is a well-named widget, and it does exactly what you're thinking if you're familiar with that word in English, viewport. As you peer into more widgets that are taking up more space than you ever actually allocated for the list view. And then as you scroll, those widgets in that larger space start to move through your field of vision. And this is, this is what happens when you scroll on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, site in general, where there's too much to fit on the screen. In fact, it's also just, it's how websites work. If they have, if there's something below the fold, then they are also maintaining some kind of viewport into the larger section of content. And a grid view is similar, except that it doesn't lay out its children in the same way. It doesn't say each child gets the full cross-axis space. Each child in a grid view gets a predefined amount of the cross-axis space, and then we move down a level and you keep allocating that predefined amount of cross-axis space, and eventually you can fill up so much space that, again, you're scrolling. So these are two very important widgets, and understanding, being comfortable with how they work is important to being a healthy and happy Flutter developer. Okay, how much of this? So I mentioned that list view can go horizontally or vertically, depending on whether you want it to be basically a scrollable column or a scrollable row. But they have different default or different constructors, and these have meaningful impact on the behavior. So that default constructor that we see up top, this one, if you have a column and it's overflowing, and you're like, I don't want it to overflow, it'd be better if it's scrolled. You can just change the word column to list view, and you're up and running. Same for a row, of course, although then you would have to change its main axis and specify that it goes in the other direction. But the default constructor for a list view takes a set of widgets predefined. They're all completely spelled out in your code, and it allows the user to scroll through them. If you don't have a huge amount of widgets, this is a totally fine way to go. But the more widgets you start to have, then the more you want to think about these next constructors, because what the default constructor does, if you give it a million widgets, however you manage to specify that many, and it will keep track of every single one in memory. And obviously the more you have, the more costly that is, and just the more pointless it is, because still only the ones that are in the viewport at any given time actually matter. All the other ones are just pure waste. So enter listview.builder. In listview.builder, you first tell it how many widgets there are in your list, and then you supply it a function, and we're going to look at this very shortly. You supply it a function, and that function is called repeatedly and is passed an integer, which represents where you are in the series of children that you said should be rendered. And this function's job is to, with its only hint being that integer of where we are on the list, it's on the hook to produce that child widget. But what's nice about the listview.builder constructor is it uses this builder as you scroll. So again, if you have a million widgets, they can all remain theoretical until the user scrolls to them, and then the builder function is called on demand. So very, very important, very common. And if you reach to the builder function as your first choice by default for, it's obviously not the default constructor, but your default, then, that's a good idea. It's always okay to use the builder constructor. Now, separated is very similar. It takes that same function that we were just talking about, but it takes an additional one as well, and that's another builder that is run in between every pair of widgets. There's a separator function that can also optionally return a widget, and this can be nice if you want some spacing, or maybe you want a line after a section break. And this function would need to check based on the integer that it's passed. Am I at a function? Am I like at a section break between two different chunks of my child widgets? If so, maybe I draw a line, or maybe you just draw a space between all of them, kind of whatever works for your UI. The separated constructor helps with that. And then custom is if you really just want to be a mad scientist, and I'm not going to lie, I have never needed to use the custom builder, so or the custom constructor, sorry. So that one is we're going to leave that as an exercise for the reader today, because you can get very far without worrying about it. Okay, next, we mentioned the future builder and asynchrony in Dart. And instead of explaining the future builder again myself, because you're all probably tired of hearing me talk by now, I want to introduce another resource that you may not know about, especially if you're new to Flutter. Going back the last 2 years, the Flutter team every week has released a video in our series called Widget of the Week. So there's over 100 of them now. And one of the early ones was the future builder, but so we're going to watch this to learn about the future builder, but also I wanted to highlight that this Widget of the Week resource is there, and it's kind of a fun catalog of all, well, not all of the widgets, otherwise we wouldn't be able to have one for next week, but many of the widgets. And it's a, when I first got into Flutter, I just kind of binged all of these. They're about 2 minutes long. They're pretty whimsical and fun. And to demo that, let's all learn together about the future builder. I don't know if the sound is coming. No, it isn't. You're not getting the sound. Okay, I am going to have to explain it after all, which I'm just going to do in the code. And anyway, widget of the week is still there, and if you watch it on your own computer, you'll get the sound. And you would have gotten it today too if I would have hooked up the correct input. Okay, well, we'll get to the future builder in the code. Nope, quit playing. That's not what we want anymore. Thank you. All right. So when we get into the code, we're going to talk about some different folder structure and organization that we did. And the first step that we have is just kind of recreating that starter code that you downloaded for chapter 5 in the in our APOD, our Astronomy Picture of the Day app. So we have a new structure. Our assets folder is a lot more involved. We have, just as the screenshot shows here, we have our Picture of the Day images folder, and then we have a JSON folder, and that stores our mock API results, which one day will actually come from the real API. But for now, we're still just hard-coded. Remember, those hard-coded API results used to just live in our Dart code. So we're already starting to break things out a bit more. Beyond that, we've organized our code in a different way as well. So the book goes with organizing your code into folders by layer of your application. And this is a totally fine way to do it. But just to demonstrate that it's not the only way and that you're completely able to choose the style that you like the most and what works for you the most, in the Astronomy Picture of the Day app, we've chosen to instead organize by feature. So we have an API folder, and that is going to store all of the logic for communicating with the outside world. Then we have a features folder, and within that are folders for each screen in the app. And then within those folders, we start to have maybe some different layers of logic. We have models, we have some views, we have screens, we have individual widgets. But however you want to organize your application is probably fine, as long as you are consistent and stick to it and apply it evenly all across your code. So I believe our next stop is in fact some code. Yes. So let's hop back over here. And I am on chapter 5, step 0. And I'm going to bring this down a little bit so we have some more breathing room. All right. Now this is, what file do we want to look at here? Let's start with our recent APOD page, because this is where we first see the future builder. So I'm going to hop over. Actually, before I do that, yep, we're going to hop over to it right away. Okay, so I'm clicking recent, and what you're going to see is a spinner for a second, and this is emulating the experience of having to go talk to the server to get the actual data that we need, and needing to show something while we're doing that. And then eventually that data comes back. Of course, we've actually had the data the whole time. This is make believe. But in the real situation, the server eventually responds, the data arrives, and now you can stop displaying whatever you were keeping the user happy with and show the actual stuff. So here we have, we're going to get a spinner for 1 second, and then the data starts to load in. And the magic of this is coming from the future builder. So a future in Dart is one of the most primitive concepts around asynchrony. And again, if you, we'll show in the, if we can get a little banner overlay, a link to the asynchrony videos from the Dart team. They're very good, 5-parter. Highly recommend that you watch them. This will be the last time I plug the videos. But a future in Dart, it's called a promise in JavaScript, if you're coming from there. Different languages have different whole paradigms and thus vocabulary to talk about asynchrony. But in Dart, it's single-threaded. So that means that things don't happen in complete parallel unless you kind of go out of your way to make that happen. But what Dart is willing to do is say, oh, this piece of code is not doing anything for an undefined amount of time. And that's very common if you're like reading a file from the disk, or if you are making a network request, or if you're computing some big function or something. Network requests, easily the most common thing. It's absolutely a spot where your code is doing nothing except waiting. And in a single threaded language, there's nothing to pick up the work if the main thread is just staring at a network response waiting for it to come back. So the way that all single threaded languages get around this, and JavaScript and Dart handle it in the exact same way, is they just tell that piece of code that is waiting, get in the back of the line, talk to me again when you're ready. And so then that single thread hops to something else that's going on. And there's, maybe not much else in your code that you've written going on, but it'll at least hop back into the Flutter framework and start rendering something like that spinner that we saw. And so the future builder is a widget that takes it takes two different things, and you can see the two parameters here are all well named. All three of these things are well named because the future builder takes a future and a builder. So nice job. And the future, this again is basically, again in JavaScript it's called a promise, which is a nice name for it because you can say this is like a promise of some future response. And I don't have it yet, but it's going to be here. And when it is, you'll be informed about it. So that's a handy thing. And then the builder is a function that is called every different milestone in the life cycle of a future. So a future first exists and is pending. And then eventually it's going to complete either successfully or it's going to complete with an error. And these are all milestones. Hopefully you don't have the error milestone in your future, but you could. And so it's good to check for it. But these are all milestones in the life cycle of a future. And the builder is called every time. And so it's allowed to return a different thing based on the state of the future. And so as we look in here, it takes this build context. This is very common. It's the same class as this build context. And then the second parameter that the builder takes is this async snapshot. And this is a typed variable, which is very helpful for us. Later down here, we're going to see snapshot.data, and the type of this data attribute is the same thing that is specified here, which we of course see VS Code is helpfully highlighting it again down here. So these have to match. And this snapshot variable has a connection state. And this is how we introspect how the future is doing. Once the future is done, which means the response has come back without an error, then we're going to start to build what we actually see here, which is the UI. But we can collapse this if statement in the IDE, and we'll jump right down to the else. So if the connection state is not done, then we're going to return the spinner. Now we've admittedly cut a bit of a corner here because there is no check for the error state. So if this were to error, the way we've coded this right now, the UI would just spin forever. So you'll have to accept our apology. We've only got 20 minutes to get through all of this, but you do want to check for a connection state.error as well. And but the two primary things, your like minimum viable implementation is some code when it's done. And then very commonly you just throw a spinner here when, if it's still pending. So this is a future. And let's see, is there anything else in this section that I want to get to? I think that's about it for this. So this was the starter code that we've adapted to our APOD app. And I'm going to hop back to the slides. And am I on the right one here? Yeah. Okay. Now a grid view is coming up next. And in chapter 5 in the book, the grid view was all about those thumbnails for recipes. Now we don't really have recipes, so we're going with favorited pictures of the APOD, favorited pictures from the server. So that's what we're going to put in the grid view on our end. And again, just to kind of remind ourselves how grid views work, just like list views, they have some multiple constructors. They have a default constructor, which just takes a hard-coded list of widgets, and it will be able to, start to lay them out in a grid. But you can also do the same thing dynamically with a builder constructor. Works the same way as a list view. There's the count, custom, extent controller, and all of these. Those are, again, kind of starting to get more advanced. That builder constructor gets you very, very far. And being familiar with the builder concept will make all of the other constructors a lot more accessible. So some key parameters on the grid view. There's the scroll direction. You might want your grid view to scroll up and down. You might want your grid view to scroll left to right. So this is where you control that. Cross-axis spacing. This, along with main axis spacing, just controls how tightly together, how packed together all of your items are in your grid, or do they all have some breathing room? Then cross-axis count. Assuming you're going in the normal kind of top-down direction, cross-axis count basically determines how many columns do you have. And we are going to set that to 2 in ours. And so you'll see, and I think it was 2 in the book as well, if I recall. So you'll see basically one item, another item, and then you go down and you've got, just 2 in each row all the way down. You have 2 columns essentially. Shrink wrap is a parameter that you pretty much only need when you're doing nesting scrolling. And just to fit in our time here, we're not doing nesting scrolling on our end. Physics, primary, by the way, is also kind of for a nested scroll. And then physics is a way where you can, if you've used iOS and Android, you're familiar with how they kind of scroll differently when you're at the boundary of a list. And this physics is how you can control that as well. If you don't supply any value for physics, then list view and grid view will just look up what platform you're on and use the correct one. So you only need to provide physics if you want to specifically control the behavior. And it's not as scary as it sounds. There's just some classes that you don't even have to think about, and they completely specify all the behavior. So it might as well be an enum, essentially. Okay, we're back to some code. So I'm going to move forward in time here. Git checkout, chapter 5, step 1 this time, add the grid view. Okay, so our old favorites page was empty a second ago. It just said, we can see here the UI because it doesn't update on git checkout. It still just says favorite APODs, and that's what used to be in this file. But now we've got some new stuff. We have another feature builder, and this is going out to our service. Oh, right, the service. Yeah, we'll have to show that in a second. Actually, I'll show that right now. So I'm going to hop over to the mock APOD service, and this is a pretty common pattern. As a developer of front ends, whether they be web or mobile, you're working with some backend developers, and they're probably building the API that you need to hit in parallel to you. And nothing will ship on time if you wait until they're done before you start. So often you'll agree on a data structure, and then they set out to build the backend and get everything going over there. And the Flutter developer on the front end just needs to mock out that data structure and be able to start working with it. So what we are doing here, first of all, we want to be able to emulate making a call. And so these functions, all that we hit within our mock picture of the day service, all return futures of whatever their thing is. So get recent APOD list. This says, hey, at some point in the future, I'm going to give you a list of pictures of the day. And this in the real world will take some time. This will not automatically, or this will not instantly complete. And so to recreate that experience, we've got this first line in here that just says, hold up a minute, wait 1 second. Don't do anything, just wait a second. And because we use the word await, that allows the Dart runtime to be like, oh, you're waiting, but I'm going to get back and do something more interesting. So your app keeps running and is responding, and the user can navigate and do whatever they want. But this function has to wait for 1 second. And then when that is done, it resumes, and then we load our asset. And again, this kind of is simulating getting the response back from the server. We JSON decode that so it comes in as a string. This will also happen when you get data back from a server. Now here on our APOD list, now we have a list of maps. And then we finally loop over that list of maps and start populating our list of actual pictures of the day objects by passing each entry in the list into the picture of the day from JSON function. And that creates a new entry, adds it to the list, and then we return it. So this all is going to do a nice job of emulating calling out to an actual server. Now, when we head back to our favorites page here, so we've got, this is what's going on under the hood in that future. And then ultimately we get in our builder, we check our connection state, we see when it's done, pretty similar stuff. You start to see this pattern repeats itself in your code. And then we here use a grid view. And now I'm going to refresh the UI so we can actually see the grid view. And it's refreshing. Okay. Now here we are, and I'm going to click on favorites. It's going to wait a second. It didn't used to do that. It used to show the text favorite APODs instantly. Now it had to fake load this data, and we're in a grid view, and we've got 3 items, and they are 3 is actually kind of a nice number to demonstrate how a grid view works, with 2 being our column count, because we can see here it starts to lay them out left to right for us, and then it wraps down to the next line, the next kind of row, if you're thinking about this as a table. And then eventually it stops, and it's fine just leaving this space open. Notice that the third one doesn't fill the whole row. It still is confined to the amount of space that its cell in the table, so to speak, was allocated. And we set up having 2 columns here by passing this grid delegate pattern parameter. And again, delegates kind of sound scary, but this one isn't too bad. It's a sliver grid delegate with fixed cross-axis count delegate. So easy peasy to say, right? But honestly, it is very simple. All we just said is give me 2 columns. And we could see right here, just set this to 3 and it'll re-render. And now we have 3 columns. And this objectively looks much worse. So we're obviously going to go back to 2. All right. Okay, so pretty easy to pilot that here. And then we've got an item count variable, very similar to a list view, and an item builder function. Again, very similar to a list view. It just takes that build context and the index, and then we start returning what we need. So, okay, folks, I think we may have reached the end here. Yeah, so there's a couple other scrolling widgets to be aware of. And the custom scroll view, again, this is very handy. Be on the lookout, by the way, for an upcoming Decoding Flutter video about different kinds of scrolling patterns and nested scrolling, and we hit custom scroll view in that. But there's a staggered grid view, which I'm not going to lie, I didn't even know about until I read chapter 5. There's a page view. Oops, let's go back here. Page view widget. This allows you to scroll left to right in entire pages. Very common pattern. So, we've all used that in many apps. Flutter has that kind of ready to go with indicator dots and all that. And all right, so we are now at the end of chapter 5. We hit grid view and list view. We saw how they can scroll horizontally or vertically. We looked at the primary and shrink wrap parameters. Those are helpful if you have nested scrolling. Again, in the APOD app, we didn't do that. Well covered in chapter 5. We looked at future builder, which is a way to control how your UI renders some data that you don't have yet. And actually barrel files we did not look at, but they are going to be heavily featured in the chapter 6 demo. So stay tuned for that. Okay. Folks, I think I've hit the end of the chapter 5 part, so I'm now going to pass the baton back over to the entire group instead of hogging the stage myself. So, okay, are we ready?
All right. Wow. Great. Thank you, Craig. That was amazing. Greatly appreciate it. And now we're getting ready to do a question and answer segment for this. And for that, I need my co-host, Sarah. So Sarah, can you join me back up on stage? Okay. And we wouldn't be doing this kind of stuff without the tech editor of the book. So Stef, can you join me on stage also?
Thank you, Craig. That was amazing. Greatly appreciate it.
All
And
right.
now we're getting ready to do a question and answer segment for this. And for that, I need my co-host, Sarah. So Sarah, can you join me back up on stage?
Who expert for kind of crazy questions, and he's working on
stuff without the tech editor of the book.
he's working on DroidCon London right now, and so in his place we've got, of course, our resident DevRel expert from Google, and let's bring Craig up on stage, please. Okay, great. Thank you for joining us back, Craig. Hopefully your audio is working okay.
Yeah, let's get a quick test. Does this sound good?
I think it sounds better. Yes.
Okay, great.
Okay, and welcome back, Sarah. All right. Okay, so I've got Scott backstage pulling up questions for me. So Scott, can you show us our first question? Okay, this was asked. Does anyone know how to access the source code so that they can practice alongside? And I absolutely. Sarah just had to step away again. Okay, so we have the GitHub link there, and Sarah's this lets out the little secret that Sarah's actually the one that wrote the code, and so that's the GitHub link for that. Anyway, github.com, Fullmer's Flutter Apprentice Book Club, and that should take care of that. Great. Okay. Do we have more questions, Scott?
We have a lot of questions. I can pull one up.
Okay, actually, Sarah, go ahead, and I think you may want to say something about the source code.
No, Stef does.
Stef
Oh, I'm
wants to
sorry.
say about the source
Stef
code.
would like to. Okay, everybody,
Okay.
this is live stuff here, and
Totally.
so I've been telling people to tell me what they, to help me guide it around, and of course, anyway, Stef, please.
Okay, so regarding the question regarding the following along, so there's two things. There's the source code that was shared that Craig is using, which was what was on the little thing that popped up if our backstage person can help with that and bring that back up. Also, the source code for the book, you can see the starter and the final projects in the GitHub that is in the resources for the book online. And then that way we've had several people who have run into some issues, and our recommendation is go and compare it to what is in the final to make sure that they put something in the wrong spot or forgot curly braces or something like that. So just wanted to add that.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. And we do have a question here, which is kind of related. It says, I have found errors or inconsistencies in the sample of Firebase auth in the book. How do I tell you about that? So Sarah,
we have,
Stef.
There's two S's. Sorry. So there are two things. We have a forum that you can just chat, ask questions, but we also have an errata, a particular place to post. And I actually have the link. I grabbed the wrong one, so I'm putting it in so it can be grabbed and put up on the screen. And if you find anything, we are human. We make mistakes. And we would, or if there are things that we need to clarify, but definitely if you find any mistakes, go ahead and post it in the errata and we'll take a look at it and get it addressed appropriately.
I am shocked. There are mistakes.
Stop it. Yes, we're human. We're not perfect as much as I tried.
Oh, I know.
We all do,
yeah,
but yeah,
and,
we make mistakes.
And sometimes people are missing certain things, but sometimes they actually are mistakes, and so that's great for the errata part. And can we share that link?
I just put it in the YouTube chat.
Okay. Okay, that sounds good. All right. Well, then I guess we're up to the next question.
Scott?
Ooh. All right. So how can I test my app on multiple different screen sizes?
All right, that's a good one. Craig?
Well, yeah, that is a very good question. There's a lot of different ways, actually, that I would recommend testing your app on multiple screen sizes. One, if you want to target specific known devices, obviously downloading those emulators and running your app on them is kind of the oldest original way to do this, but that is a bit of a pain, I admit. Another way that you can do this is to run your app in desktop mode. And if you do that, then you just get a very flexible, resizable window and not a mobile device emulator, which of course has a fixed size. And you actually see in these videos, that's what I'm using. I'm running it in desktop mode. I'm not targeting a mobile emulator. So I'm able to just click on a corner and drag it around and see exactly in real time how the UI responds.
All right. And device preview package, I think, is something that's interesting for that. And that's a package that's out there that also can help with that.
Oh, yes. I've never used this package, but
I have not either.
I should be because look at
Thanks
how
for
amazing it
sharing
is.
that. That's pretty awesome.
Wow. All right. Thanks for
I
sharing
like
that,
that.
Scott.
I'm definitely going to do that. Yeah, that's our behind the scenes. I can't claim that I knew that. That was a little voice in my ear that told me that. So
Cool.
yeah. All
We're
right,
all learning.
great. These are good. We're getting off to a great start with these questions. Do we have more?
We surely do.
Yeah, there were a couple about.
All right.
Here we go.
Can we think of Dart processing features the same way JavaScript does with an event loop? Does Dart have an event loop, or does it use something else? And Craig, can you answer that for us?
Yeah, so great question. Dart does have an event loop, and it behaves more or less identically to JavaScript's event loop. One little known fact about Dart is one of its first original features was to be able to transpile itself into JavaScript. And it can still do that. It's not used that often, but it can. And that means, a very important way, or like a thing that helps you implement that, is having the same asynchronous model under the hood, and it is an event loop. Now, the link that we shared earlier in that overlay, that is for a series of videos that explain exactly this. But maybe a more friendly way to find those videos is to just search Flutter in Focus, then what was it, isolates and event loop or something like that. If you plug that in, you'll find the videos, and it's that 5-parter. Each one's about 6-7 minutes. And at the end of it, you will feel a lot more comfortable, I expect.
All right, that's great. Yes, thank you. I love that series. The way it describes it, and it does a great job of kind of letting us know the difference between what the event loop does and when things happen and stuff like that. So that's really good.
Yep.
All right, how about the next question? Why do we get an unbounded height error without shrink wrap? I know it gives a fixed height, but I don't understand why that error occurs in the first place.
One is a mystifying scenario for many new Flutter developers. The next decoding Flutter video is completely dedicated to this. So Richard, you've asked a burning question. Now, the short take here is that the way list views work is that they are bigger on the inside than on the outside. So what the list view is a viewport into a much larger space of widgets. And if one of the widgets that's scrolling through your viewport is itself a viewport into more widgets, it just gets too confusing, and it's very unclear how you would render that and like what would happen when you scroll. So what shrink wrap does is it forces one of those lists to completely evaluate itself and figure out its height. And that allows it to not request unbounded height, which is what you see in the error message. And so then your inner list, once set with shrink wrap equals true, now can kind of proceed through the parade of widgets as it's going through your outer list views viewport, as if it's all just one widget. It all just kind of scrolls together, however long it is. And so if you have a small inner list, that's a totally fine solution. It's not a problem at all. The larger your inner list is, the more you are forcing Flutter to render up front. And that is kind of what the upcoming decoding Flutter video gets into. But this will even override using listview.builder on that inner list. You might think, oh, well, that's okay. I'm using listview.builder. So I've got 1,000 widgets here, but no big deal. They're all being built dynamically. Not if you set shrink wrap to true. So stay tuned to that video for even more information on this, including how to fix it. But that's what shrink wrap does. And that's the scenario. That's like the reasoning behind the error and the kind of mysterious language you see in the error message.
And I actually you guys are coming up with a great Flutter and Focus videos. They're always great. I wanted to point out that Philip did a video a few months ago called Unbounded Height / Width under Decoding Flutter. And it was just a lot of fun. It was fun hearing Philip do different voices and stuff like that as he's trying to describe how the description of it is that what goes down and it goes down and comes back up, right? So
yeah, constraints go down, size comes up.
Size comes back up, right? Exactly. I knew it was the request and the actual what it could be, but I was drawing a blank on that. So,
and that means, by the way, this little quip that we say constraints go down, size goes up. That means a parent widget says to its child widget, "This is how big you could be. How big would you like to be?" So the constraints go down, and then the child evaluates those constraints and determines how big it will be, in fact, and then tells the parent, "I will be such and such big." So that's what she's talking about.
Yep, that's awesome. And then we had kind of a little bit of a follow-up there about shrink wrap. So how come shrink wrap solves this problem?
Yeah, so I'm guessing that question was kind of picked before the answer, but we'll just hit it again real quick. So shrink wrap forces the inner list to completely evaluate itself, and thus it no longer has to think of itself as this fixed space that is bigger on the inside. It now just becomes however big the inside is. So it must be evaluatable, which I think is probably a word. And so setting shrink wrap on that inner list means you no longer have two things like nested within each other, both trying to be of potentially infinite height, which is a concept that if you think about it, just kind of like I don't even know how that would work. So that's why it can't.
And since I'm putting Craig on the hot seat here, how does that compare to, like, say, intrinsic height or intrinsic width?
Oh, interesting. I am not an expert on that, so I think I don't know, but it does the widget is allowed, or not allowed, is capable of reporting its size. Whereas like a list view internally does not necessarily know its size. It can't report anything because, especially if you're using the .builder method, then it doesn't know yet. So
that sounds great. All right, Scott, bring up the next question. All right. Hi, how can I know which class to use in a function parameter? Usually it suggests an abstract class, but I cannot use it directly. How can I know all classes that extend from this abstract class?
That's a great question. Stef or Sarah, I would like to just offer an opportunity. I'm doing a lot of talking. Okay, I'll take this one as well.
Go ahead and take that one, because
I might have.
I'm having trouble with it.
If you've got an abstract class and you go to flutter.dev and you look up that abstract class, there's going to be a C also with the concrete implementations, I believe.
That's it. Yep.
Okay. I knew what to do. It just didn't think it was right. That was really bad of me.
No, that's it.
Have confidence. I've always told you that. I've always told you that.
Yeah, I also will, like, I'm not sure about VS Code, but I'll go into Android Studio and I'll click and go through to the code, read all the documentation that's in the Flutter Dart code behind the scenes, and then I go to the docs. So yeah. Okay.
If you use Android Studio, Command B is your friend. If you just click on the class and then Command B, it will take you straight to the source code in the editor, and it's really nice. You can read the very thorough comments that are there, and usually it explains what you're looking for.
And you can actually end up going into a rabbit hole because you can just keep going and keep going. So
That's true.
if you've got a time constraint, be mindful of that.
That's a very good question, though, Ben. I sometimes am still bedeviled by that myself. And another trick, everything they just said is absolutely correct. Another trick you can do is have a copy of the Flutter source open in another IDE window. I love to do this. And then you can just do a whole search in that for extends and the abstract class name. And that'll probably highlight, many of the files. Some might have might add something in as a mix-in or something like that. You might not catch everything, but that'll show you a lot of classes that say like class something else extends the thing you care about. So that can help.
And why do we use abstract classes?
Oh yeah, so that's just kind of a basic like programming design question. An abstract class specifies, some languages call them interfaces, but whatever kind of mysterious word is used for this, they define a set of functionality, like a contract is another way that this is put often. So you might say, I need a class that, like delegates, we see these a lot in different widgets that we're using. These delegates specify different behavior. And the way that we know that this delegate is up to the task is that it implements a certain amount of functions that are required to do the job. And an abstract class might sit somewhere else and just enumerate all of those functions. If you're going to be the physics delegate for grid view, like we just talked about, then you need to implement like should scroll and, how do I behave in this situation and whatever the functions are. And then in any sort of class will say extends this abstract class, and or implements often is also another word. You can search for that if you're doing the have Flutter open in another window trick. Implements the abstract class, and now your code won't even compile until you do in fact implement all of those methods.
I think Sarah has something.
Hopefully that was
I think
helpful.
Stef has something to add.
Yeah, not specific to this, but where we were talking about when looking into the source code. If you do that and you're going in, which is totally fine, it's there, it's awesome to have. If you accidentally hit space or you do something, so when you go to do a Flutter upgrade, you may get a warning that you need to do a force to do a Flutter upgrade. So just have that. It's not like you broke anything, but just be aware of that because, well, I'm speaking from experience. The first time that happened, I thought, oh my God, I broke Flutter.
All right, well, I think we have time for one more question before we move on. So, can you tell me something about async snapshot?
Well, there's a lot of things I could tell you. But first, Sarah, Stef, do either of you want to take anything here?
Go for it. Unless Sarah's got something.
I think Craig explained it really well in the video. But basically, it's what you are going to get as the result in your future builder. And then you can check, does it have your data? Is there an error? Is it still going? And then act appropriately. Present the correct widgets.
Yeah,
and probably a lot of important things. So.
It's just a container for all of the things that you care about in that important callback to the future builder, which is under the builder parameter. So yeah, it's just a bucket that holds all of the stuff that's important to you, like the results of the future, the state of the future. And that function will be called multiple times as the future kind of lives its life and goes through all of its different milestones. But it's just a Dart class. There's nothing magical about it. You could write a similar kind of class yourself. It's just a piece of Dart code with a couple of attributes, and they are the exact attributes that you care about in that moment.
All right. And I'd like to kind kind of comment on something that Craig had said. As many of you know, and if you don't know, Simon is like the Flutter community. Like he's the know-it-all expert because he does, not because he's a know-it-all, but because he actually knows it all. And the way he got there is by what Craig suggested, which is by looking at the source code and digging in and figuring out what it does. It's not by the fact that he was born that way or even just independently figured it out. He looks at the source code. So I would suggest,
and he still does it. Sorry to interrupt.
He still learns stuff.
He does it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
so I highly recommend that. So all right, well, it's about time to go on to get ready. So Craig, if you get ready for the upcoming segment, and I'll send the rest of these people off stage and bring Scott back on. All right, now, and Scott, you are muted, just so you know. But what I want to say is the fact that the Flutter community does a great job bringing free content to you that you can do. They put on Hump Day Q&A. They do all sorts of things like that. And while it's free to you, it's not free to us to create it. So they've got a Patreon. And Scott, I'd like you to tell us about that. And you can send me off screen.
All righty. Let's see here. First, don't go far, Danielle. We'll need you in a moment. Yeah. Sorry about that. It was a little fast. All right. And before I dig into this for a moment here, let me tell you a super secret about Simon. He lives in the documentation to the point where some of us begin to worry about him. Okay. One of the first things that Simon taught me was if you're coding in one window and you don't have the documentation in another, you're doing it wrong. So if you have your IDE open, you need to have the documentation open in the other window at all times. And hopefully you'll actually look at it. With that said, let's take a look here. These are some of the things that Flutter community does for you on a regular basis. We just wanted to point a number of these out. We do have the Flutter community Medium, and the Medium has, excuse me a moment. There we go. The Medium has about 600,000 minutes read every 30 days. Another great one is the Flutter community Slack. And if you look here in the upper right, you will see we've got over 15,000 members waiting to answer your questions. Now, interesting factoid. People keep asking us why we don't have a paid Slack. It's $5 US a person. You do the math. So, moving on, we also have the Flutter community GitHub, where we give homes to orphan packages. We find the maintainers. There is, and there it is right there. Sorry. We have been behind Hack 19, Hack 20. Hump Day Q&A brings on all kinds of guests. Whoops, sorry about that. Including Kevin and Miriam and Chris from the Flutter team. All of them were from the Flutter team. We provide speakers for your GDGs and for larger events. And look, it's Simon in the background, and he is actually on that floor today, but this was 3 years ago. So we also have been speaking and doing things at Flutter Europe, the Geekly Flutter Global Summit, which is upcoming in December, their second one. We had a panel in New York after Flutter Interact where we actually got 12 of us up on stage at the same time. It was very, very interesting evening. So we were also working with Google last time on 30 Days of Flutter. And so the book club is not our first time collaborating. We've also worked with Flutter Vikings, the Flutterista conference. I have never seen a 4-day conference before. Flutteristas was. Also bringing you interviews with great people like Nilay, Brian Egan, who is behind Redux for Flutter, Martin Jarrett, CEO of Nevercode, and Philip. So then we also have some videos with that guy and Hump Day Q&A. Now, as we said, Hump Day Q&A is a weekly program, but a lot of this stuff is taking up enough time that we can't always get there every single week, unfortunately. But you might be able to help that, because if we can get ourselves a community manager, a lot of this stuff will work much more smoothly. They'll be able to line up guests. They'll be able to take over the editing of the Medium. They'll be able to take over management of the GitHub, and we will be able to sleep at night. We would very much appreciate that. So if you can, if you're making money off the things that you learned from the community, please consider giving back to the Patreon at Patreon Flutter_community. If you have not made any money in Flutter yet, then it's our free gift to you. Okay, wait until you are cashing checks. Wait until they are transferring money into your bank. Then think about seeing what you might be able to do to give back and help making sure that we can continue with this. Now, I have babbled on and on more than long enough. So let's see if we can get Danielle back up here.
Thank you very much, Scott. And
what happened?
I know, I don't know, but you're going away anyway, so bye-bye.
It's mini-me. It's a mini-me.
All right, we need to get back into this because this next segment has a lot of meat to it. And I want to remind people as they're watching, if you have a question, put a Q in front of the question. That helps us identify it and get to it faster. And now, without any further ado, let's have Craig teach us about Chapter 6.
Hey folks, welcome back. It's time for Chapter 6, which is all about interactive widgets with Provider. And there's a good reason the Provider shows up in the chapter with interactive widgets, because if your users are interacting with stuff, you're going to need to probably save those interactions. You're going to need to respond to those interactions in a meaningful way. And that is our first hint of state management. And that's always been on the horizon for us, but now we're finally starting to get there. So let's get into it. Okay, so we are going to go through the different sections that you saw in Chapter 6. We're going to get going with Provider. We don't add a shopping list because I'm not really sure how you would go like shopping for stars or something. So our version of the shopping list from Chapter 6 is going to be just a journal where you make note of interesting things that you learn about stars. And there's going to be a lot of interactivity on that. We do add the dismissible widget around things, so it's pretty good. Okay, and let's look at an overview of what we're going to do. First, we are adding Provider, as mentioned. We're going to go into kind of what that means and how to think about it and where to put the different parts. We update our tab navigation so that starts to be driven by Provider, so that we can tell our app what page to be on, as opposed to only waiting for the user to click a tab. And this is an important thing to be able to do. We say that is like programmatically driving the navigation, or programmatically driving, whatever, is to be able to tell it ourselves what to do instead of waiting for the user to click something. We also are going to get into some different input widgets in the form where the user in the book, it's creating a grocery list item, but for us it's a journal entry. And then we do hit the gesture part where we want our notes to be dismissible. Maybe you think something's interesting at first, and then later you read it again, you're like, actually that's not that interesting. I don't want anyone to know I thought that was interesting, and you delete it. All right, next slide. Okay, so first we're going to hop into some code, and we are on step 1 of Chapter 6, where we add the Notes tab. So the first thing that I want to point out is our new bottom nav bar changes. So if I go to the home page, we'll see that first things first, we have a new item at the bottom. I just gave it a little journal icon, and it's already there, or no, bookmark, and then we call it a journal. Yeah, anyway, it's already rendering. And of course, we have to keep our number of tabs in sync with our number of pages. So we've added an empty journal page here. And then there's also actually, we'll hop over to the journal. So we'll look at our journal page. And this isn't too interesting yet. We've got a floating action button that doesn't do anything because it has it just has an empty, actually, you know what? This is wrong. And I spent like an hour last night debugging this, and it goes away in the next phase, step 2. But I put an entire button in my button, and then I literally spent an hour trying to figure out why this click handler wasn't doing anything. That's because the apps were being intercepted by this one, and that kind of tanked my evening. So when you get stuck and you think like, why won't this work? What's going on? Something's not behaving as I expect. And then you finally figure it out and it's like kind of simple and makes you feel a little silly. Know that you're in it. I don't know if I'm good company or not, but if I am, then you're in good company because it happens to me too. What I actually just wanted was to show the icon only. And again, this is fixed in the next step when I actually realized the mistake that I'd made. But we have a floating action button. It doesn't do anything. And then we just automatically show our empty journal view. So this isn't very optimistic. We have no concept of actually having journal entries yet. But this here, we have a couple interesting widgets. We use this aspect ratio widget around our clipboard image. And this is doing, what you would expect, where this is going to keep that image as a square as we resize, which is really handy. We're also we're accessing the size of the screen to start thinking about dynamic sizes. So we're hitting the media query of the context. And this is a little bit of, kind of interesting looking syntax when you're new to Flutter, but you'll get used to this and type it a lot. So we're using the context to find our current media query. And then we get the size of the entire screen. And then we start sizing things based on that. And we can see that our image is wrapped in a sized box, which uses the width. So as our size changes, we will see the image changes with it. It doesn't stay small and start to look really silly. So this is one of the ways that you can begin to have your UIs respond to different screen sizes. And then we just have some more empty stuff. And ultimately down here, we have a material button. I said empty stuff. It's this text, no journal entries, and the tap the edit button thing. But then at the bottom, we have our browse APODs button. And in the book, this linked you back to the recipes list. So we figured if you need some inspiration about what to put in your journal of cool facts, then you just hop back over to previous pictures of the day and start reading. Now, this button again doesn't do anything yet, and this is going to be interesting because it needs to drive navigation, and that's where stuff starts to get interesting, and that's where provider shows up. Now I'm going to go back here and just undo this so I don't have to mess with it with Git. This will go away when we move forward to step 2. And then lastly, we have a journal entry model. And this is pretty simple. It has an ID, title, body, and date. Went with less fields than in the book. The color picker and the amount of text fields and the chips for the importance and whatnot. That's a very cool bit of functionality to work through and think about. So I highly recommend actually visiting that in chapter 6. But we're just going to do a little bit of a simplified version of that here. But this is our journal entry, and it has a nice copy with method, which is important when we're getting into actually creating and updating and modifying these things. So this copy with method, you give it, generally you have all the parameters be optional, and then you make a new entry where you use either what was passed in or the existing value on the current journal entry that we're dealing with here, because this is a method on an instance of a journal entry. So we return a new one as opposed to modifying ourselves. And this, you want to stay true to yourself. You don't just want to change for whoever comes along. But no, in UI programming, it's very helpful in ways that are kind of outside the scope of this to have data that never changes. And that's incompatible with a UI, which of course must change. So when something does in fact need to change might feel wasteful, but you actually just make a copy of the old thing with your modifications and you throw out the old value. And again, that does feel a little wasteful, but phones and computers are really fast and powerful these days, and it simplifies things later on, so it's worth doing. Okay, so that is our starting code. None of this does anything, none of it's wired up to anything, and that's where we start to need provider. So coming back over here, so we had that button that was not doing anything. I'm going to pop back over and remind us which button I'm talking about here. This is on our empty journal view. We have a material button which says browse astronomy picture of the days, and it has no press handler. And what this needs to do is change which tab we're on. But the tricky thing is that the tab logic is all the way over here in this homepage file. And we've got a selected index here and, you know, different pages. And so it's like, how are we going to have our journal page start to drive this behavior? And the way that, you know, there's a couple ways you can do this. The first thing that you could do is pass a function, which is called a callback in this context. So you pass a function or a callback to your lower part of the UI, and it will know how to manipulate something higher above. The lower part of your UI, the button, doesn't have any idea what this callback does. It just presses the button because that's what it was told to do. And this works well if you only pass the function down one level, and we will be using this later on. And it actually would in fact be one level right now because we can see the journal. Well, it would be two because the journal page is our first thing. So journal, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Journal page would have to receive this function, this navigation function, and then it would have to forward it along to empty journal view. And then empty journal view would receive it up here. And then it would finally be able to make use of it down in this material button thing. So 2 hops, in my opinion, is already it's already too much. I think 1 passing of a callback is the maximum that feels okay. And so we already kind of don't want to create a function that modifies the selected index and pass it to journal page, because also it's 2 widgets now, but you know, it's gonna end up being 10 widgets. And later on, for some other piece of functionality, it'll be 20 widgets, and like wiring this parameter through every single time is just a lot. So we don't want to do that. And that if you do solve your problem that way, then you know you are in the bad place for callbacks, so to speak. And this is actually live footage of a woman who's currently suffering in the callback bad place. You can see here as she's realizing, surely I don't need to actually be passing these parameters through so many intermediate classes that have no knowledge of them, by the way. They have no concept. It's another thing to think about. This journal page here, which has to receive the parameter and pass it forward to empty journal view, it doesn't care, you know? It doesn't use that function, so why should it be made aware of it by accepting the parameter? It would also vastly reduce our code reusability. But if this journal page was actually something more generic, and now all of a sudden it has to like accept this one weird callback to do what exactly? You know, so all the intermediate widgets, it's more important than just avoiding TDM and headache for yourself, but they really must remain ignorant of a callback that originates above them and is used below them. So we don't want journal page to know about this callback, and this woman has unfortunately told journal page about the callback and is now living to regret that decision. Okay, so provider is a thing that I have alluded to being able to solve this problem. And it can. So how does provider work? What is provider? It's a package written in Dart, which is available to use for free. And in the past, we've talked about widgets whose job it was to answer questions for widgets below them. If you recall that from previous weeks, there were layout widgets and there's actual content widgets. And then there was that other kind, they were called inherited widgets. And I said their job is to answer questions for widgets below them. And provider is where we start to do that. So the provider, it's like the other end of a phone a friend situation. And it sits at the top. You can only phone a friend up the widget tree. So you want to generally put your question answering widgets, your providers, as high in the widget tree as you can. And you'll see where we put them momentarily, pretty high up. And then when something actually needs to phone a friend, if there's a widget that's going to need to ask one of these questions and get an answer, then that you wrap in a consumer widget. We see here, this also comes from the provider package. And the consumer widget establishes a connection arbitrarily far up the widget tree and finds the relevant provider and is capable of asking questions of it and even automatically watching if some of the values change and rebuilding locally. So this consumer widget here could watch something in the provider, and whenever it changes, the consumer widget will update itself, and then all these three widgets down here will all re-render themselves. And they might render the same thing if the change actually didn't matter for them. Maybe only like this widget down here in the bottom right. Oh, I've clicked something. I've made a grave mistake. Maybe only this bottom right widget will update. Doesn't really matter. All we know is this consumer widget is going to trigger everything below it to redraw. So this is incredibly handy because this widget doesn't have to know anything about this connection. This widget doesn't have to know anything about this connection. Look at this one is so far away. There would be so many widgets it would have had to know. So provider is a very, very good pattern in this way. So we've talked about consumer. Now change notifier. This is actually just in the core Flutter framework. This is something that is able to hold on to a list of interested parties and inform them whenever there's an event, whenever something happens or when some data changes. And that's obviously pretty handy. It relates a lot to what we were just talking about. And in fact, provider makes use of that exact pattern to actually connect everything and make everything work. So now we're going to go back to some code, and I am going to take a step forward in time. I'm going to check out chapter 6, step 2, and we're going to look at adding a tab manager. That's the first thing that we do in this part. So our provider needs some kind of class to hold all of the logic. We have to import material here because that's where change notifier is. But our tab manager, this is going to start being in control of which tab we're on. And so we can see here that it has a function go to tab, which takes an index, and we can use this to go to any tab that we want. It also, we already knew that we needed to have a specific thing that goes to the recent pictures of the day. And so we're going to expose a dedicated function for that. Now, there's this other line in both of these methods, notify listeners. This is critical. This is what connects the change notifier to all of its interested parties. And if you don't call change notify, or sorry, if you don't call notify listeners in one of your methods, then you will notice your UI does not actually update because those consumers didn't get the memo that stuff happened. So you do control when a change notifier kind of sends up a bat signal and lets everybody know that like stuff's happening in Gotham. So tab manager, that's the first thing that we look at in step 2. And then we also hop over quickly to our pubspec.yaml file and just note that provider is a package that we installed to make this part, to bring all of this together. And, when you get to this part, you will also need to open up your pubspec.yaml file, type in provider. We haven't used a ton of packages yet in the Astronomy Picture of the Day app, but now we're starting to get into it. And then we'll look at our main.dart file. I promised you that I was adding the providers very high in our widget tree, And I was not kidding because it is right in our material app where I'm putting the different providers, and you can even put the providers around the material app. You can go even higher than I did, but unless I want to control these themes with providers, then this is high enough. But where I've positioned them now, it's actually worth noting this wouldn't support a light mode, dark mode toggle. I would need to put this multi-provider above the material app, but we're not doing that yet. So we're in good shape here. And so I've added a multi-provider widget around the homepage. The homepage widget used to live right here, but now we've got a multi-provider widget first, and its child is that old homepage widget. And there's only one provider now, but that's not going to last long. There will be two in like, a couple minutes. And this change notifier provider, so we can already see it's combining all these different concepts. And it creates an instance of the tab manager and is willing to pass that down to widgets lower in the tree. And this makes a very logical next step is to go look at our homepage. And our homepage immediately uses a consumer widget, which we saw. And the consumer widget specifies which thing it wants. So it wants to go find a provider that gives it a tab manager. And then it takes a builder method. Actually, I'm not in love with my spacing here. Can we get a trailing comma? There we go. Way better. Okay, so it takes a builder method, which takes a build context like normal. It takes an instance of whatever we're talking about, so tab manager, and then this child, this is like a possible optimization for how we render stuff, which we're not actually using here. And notice now that our bottom navigation bar says its current index is the tab manager.selected tab. And we don't even have a selected index variable here anymore. It's just gone. The homepage doesn't need to worry about that because it's now deriving everything from the tab manager. So which page we show, of course, that has to come from the tab manager. Which icon in the bottom nav bar we render as a special color, that comes from the tab manager. And then on tap, we used to just set the selected index directly ourselves in this file, but now we're calling the tab manager's go to tab method. And you can note that the line that I've written here on line 40 is equivalent to this set of these three lines. They do the exact same thing here. And this is maybe a little more clear. So I wanted to kind of talk about the why these things are equivalent. If we passed the on tap, we pass to the on tap parameter of the bottom navigation bar a function that takes an integer, and all we do inside is call a different function that takes an integer, then we can instead just pass that inner function. We don't call it, which is what kind of makes line 40 look a little funny. We don't call go to tab, we just pass go to tab. See here, we're passing a function and we're not calling it. I'm just defining a function and saying you call this later whenever you want. But internally, it's just calling another function that take the exact same parameters. So it's the exact same thing for us to pass the inner function uncalled, just like this was uncalled, to OnTap directly. So that's what we'll go with, and we'll just leave this commented out. Okay, what's next? So we're on the home page. I'll save this again. Oh yeah, and now our empty journal view. So this is the button, right? So I'm going to click over that right now. Now Browse APODs is able to again use the provider package to go get a tab manager. And the way this works is you have to pass the context variable. This is the glue that connects everything together. And we'll pass some other parameters saying, don't set up a subscription, don't watch the variable, just get it once. And that gets us the tab manager. And then we call on the tab manager, go to recent APODs. And so if all of this works, now clicking this button should actually move us to the recent tab. And it does. Nice. So we didn't pass callbacks all the way through our UI. Wasn't a ton of widgets yet, but the more complex your app gets, the more widgets will sit between your root and, you know, buttons deep in your UI. And so we didn't pass a callback through that whole thing. We just reached back up and plucked it from the top and called it where we needed to. And this is fundamental to Flutter development. All right. So I'm going to pop back over here and keep going. Okay, so the next thing that we do is fix the fact that our tab doesn't do anything. This new journal tab doesn't actually create any notes or journal entries or whatever we call them. So there's a concept in programming called CRUD, which is a rather unfortunate acronym, but it stands for create, read, update, and delete. And if you think about it, those are kind of the 4 possible operations that you can perform on some data. And so when people talk about CRUD, they're talking about just all the data management that you need. You need to be able to make stuff. You need to be able to edit it, you know, unless it's a tweet, because then that wouldn't have update. That'd just be CRD. But it, you know, if Twitter ever lets us update or fix typos in our tweets, then they'll have CRUD again. But you know, it's just the full set of operations that you do to data. So we are going to start adding that to our app. Okay, now we've talked a bit about how wiring callbacks through too many widgets is you know, capital B bad, but sometimes you actually do just pass a function down to a lower widget. And generally for me, I feel like if I'm only passing it one widget, then it feels okay. Or if it's staying in the same file, then I'm more comfortable with just passing that function through as a direct callback. So it's not as if you must always use provider. If you ever need some functionality in a higher level widget to be triggered, I really got to stop bumping the mic, by a lower widget. So I'm going to keep going here. Now we're back to some code. All right. So let's go to Git, check out chapter 6, step 3, add journal manager. Okay, so first thing here is we've got a new class. We had tab manager before, and now we have journal manager, and it follows a very similar, you know, it plays a similar role to the tab manager. It extends change notifier, it maintains some internal data, and then it has these different functions that perform the CRUD operations. You know, read, that's basically this one right here, return the list. Delete is obvious. Add, this is basically create, so the C in CRUD, and then update is update. And at the end of each one, we call notify listeners, because these are when the data changes. So this journal manager looks pretty similar to the tab manager. That means it shouldn't be too surprising that when we go to our main.dart file, we see that we now have a new notifier, a new provider, also making available our journal manager to the entire app. And then the next thing that we do, we go over to the journal page, and we can see that it starts to not so pessimistically always show the empty journal view, but instead is going to use a consumer to go grab the journal manager. And then in its builder function, we say, hey, Mr. Manager, is our entries list empty? If it is empty, then of course we have to show the empty journal view. If it is not empty, then show the list view that actually has all of our journal entries. Pretty, you know, this is already starting to look a lot more, it's got a lot more potential than the way we'd coded it before. Now there's still some problems. Our floating action button doesn't do anything. So we've got, oh, and I apparently by this step still had not fixed this button, but it is coming, I promise. Whew, that was such a time sink last night. But I'm going to now take a step forward, git checkout, chapter 6, step 4, add journal CRUD. Is this when I did it? Yeah, we can finally see. It's just the icon now, not the whole button. All right, so we're on journal page, and first things first, our floating action button does something. And you can see that this is when I fixed this, because this is when I started to make this button try to do something and notice that it didn't. But that's what glues everything together. We specify what thing we're going to get. It's a journal manager, and that returns for us the journal manager. And then we kind of forget about that for a second and go back to the navigator so that we can push a new page onto the navigation stack. And that takes a builder, a little bit of boilerplate here, but ultimately we're going to use this new add journal entry page class, which is a full screen page in our app. And we pass it an on save function. The book used an on create and on update, and it had those be different. And I just thought, yeah, it'd be nice if we collapse that down to a single on save function, and we'll pass a different function whether we are editing or creating a brand new one. And because here we press the floating action button, if we go back to our thing, this is a new button. And actually, I'm kind of realizing now it's not the best icon, but this is a new entry, so we know that we're adding. So on save can just handle that distinction ourselves. Okay, so let's see here. What's our next step? Yes, we're going to look at add journal. And this is a simplified version of what they do in chapter 6. The color picker and the chips for the importance of the grocery item. Those are great exercises, and I highly recommend going through them. But just to kind of streamline our process, our journal entry only has a couple fields. So I'm going to click on this button. Oh, it's not doing anything. That's good. Oh, I think I need to refresh. I'm still on the old build, which has the button covering the button. It almost got us again today. So now the button does something. And so this looks familiar if you've gone through chapter 6, just a couple fields. We don't have the color picker or the chips, but save button in the upper right. So I'm going to make one now, actually. And deep thoughts. Yeah, sure. Let's actually call it deep thoughts. No, we can't do that. Let's call it hello world. You have to call it hello world. And the body goes here. This is great. You can press shift enter and get more lines. We can put emojis in here. I'll put the ta-da emoji. That's my favorite one. And we'll pick a date. Let's go Saturday. And there we go. And so we save, and now it shows up. Very exciting. So let's talk about kind of some more things that glued all this together. So our add journal page creates, first of all, if we receive a widget, or sorry, an entry, and notice that this is an optional entry, it can be null. And this is the kind of the first branch between whether we're creating a new one or we're editing one. If we're editing one, this won't be null. If we're creating a new one, then the existing widget or entry will be null. And then down in our state class, we initialize all of our controllers with the values from the entry if it wasn't null. So we can click back on this and it returns us to the page with the old values pre-populated. And it's this kind of code in every app you've ever used that powers this kind of behavior where the form is pre-populated if you're editing. And we do a little cleanup when we're done. This frees up some resources. Now this save entry method, this isn't what we were passed. That's down here, the on save, which we receive at the top level. But first, we have our own save entry button, which in our scaffolds app bar, we set an action here. That's what gives us this check mark in the upper right. And then when someone presses on the check mark, we call our own save entry function. And save entry first makes a journal entry by pulling everything off of the different inputs, or keeping the old entry's ID if we're editing. This is critical. And then once we have a journal entry that's ready to go, then we call the onSave method that we were passed. And this actually goes to the journal manager and saves the entry. And I think this is, there's one other detail I wanted to talk about. We, in in the book, and so far in the Astronomy Picture of the Day app, we have broken out build methods by using helper methods. And simplifying build methods is an important job, because otherwise they will just keep growing. And then you've got like suddenly hundreds of lines of UI in one function. It's very hard to reason about, and it's a bad idea. So one way that you can do it is you just grab a slice of code, put it in a different method, and then call that method in your build method. And that works. But there's a different way that is actually slightly better for reasons that are probably too complicated to get into right now. But it's important to flag because it feels more expensive. At least it did to me when I was first getting into Flutter and thinking about it. And that is to create a brand new stateless widget entirely. So it's not, the world is not at stake in either of these options, whether you use a helper method or an entirely new stateless or stateful widget. But it can feel more expensive to make a new widget, but it is in fact not really more expensive. And so I've opted here. I'm just making new stateless widgets, and they have their own build methods, and I do have to kind of forward these controllers. So it's a little bit more work if you're in another method on the same class. Then any of these variables will just still be in scope, and you can access them, and you might not have to even pass the different controllers or whatever the parameters are through to those sub-widgets. So you do have to do a little bit more work for that. But also notice that I've named all these with a leading underscore because they're private. And that means that these are just internal details to the add journal entry page. And I'm certain as a developer that none of my other calling code is going to care about these. And the only thing that the outside world needs to know about is this top level add journal entry page widget. And then all these other widgets down here that are helping me get the job done, these are, kind of behind the curtain, just implementation details. Okay, so this is CRUD for our app here. And now I'm going to go back to the slides and we'll take a step forward. Okay, we're almost there. I know it's been a long one. Chapter 5 and 6 were pretty meaty. But there's a really cool bit of functionality that they do in the book where you can start to swipe and dismiss and ultimately delete grocery items. And we're doing the same thing here. Maybe you learned something about some star or galaxy, and then later you're like, oh, that's not exciting, and you want to delete it. So we're adding the same thing. We are ready for code here. So I'm going to say git checkout chapter 6 step 5, and I actually think I screwed up the branches. I don't think I committed anything to this branch. I think I have to go all the way to the final branch. When I typed something to untype, what did I do? Oh, right, that trailing comma. Not bothering with that. There will be no trailing comma again. Okay, chapter 6 final. Here we go. So, the dismissible widget. This is a pretty cool, oh, it's not in the add journal entry page. It's in the journal list page, right? Yeah, journal list view, I ended up calling it. So here we have our consumer. Again, this is what draws the list, and it goes and gets a journal manager. We're starting to get kind of used to this. We grab all the entries. We use a list view.builder, very common. We have a gesture detector, so all of these are navigatable. But then ultimately down here in the child of the gesture detector, we also use the dismissible widget. And this is what starts to create, oh, do I have to rebuild? Probably do. Rebuild. Oh, I think we're going to maybe have lost that entry. Yes. Because this was not a stateful hot reload, this was a full restart. So I am going to just call this whatever and whatever, and I don't care. So pick a day. Great. Okay, so this dismissible widget is what starts to wire up this functionality, which is very common in UIs. We've all seen this before, whether you're archiving messages in Gmail or just lots of apps have this. And it's this simple in Flutter to do it. We had our tile before. It was just sitting here by itself. and we want the whole thing to be dismissible. So we're just going to wrap it in a dismissible widget. And we specify the direction that you should be able to swipe. And we specify what should draw under the widget once you start swiping it. And then we give it a function which says, what should I do when the dismiss is completed? So first we're going to use our manager and actually delete the item so that it's like gone for real and not just misleadingly not in the UI, it's actually deleted. And then the dismissible widget will handle deleting it from the UI. We don't need to do that, but then we'll just show a little confirmation message. So let's demo that real quick. I'm going to start swiping this over and it goes away, and then we get ASDF deleted, which is good because that was not the best note of my journaling career. All right. So I think we are now, yes, this is the end. So we talked about provider. We talked about how that can allow widgets buried deep in your UI to get answers to their burning questions from high up in your UI without having to wire everything all the way through. We talked about, though, sometimes you do pass a callback from one widget to the next, and that's generally if the widget just below me is going to use this. That happens when you break widgets apart, like I did in the add list view UI, where I didn't use helper methods. I used other widgets, and I had to pass the controller forward. Didn't bother with provider to pass that the text editing controller down. We talked about CRUD. That's a common UI or a common programmatic concept that is not at all unique to Flutter. So if you talk to your other programming friends, you're like, oh yeah, got some like data CRUD. They're going to know what you're talking about, even if they don't use Flutter. We hit different form elements, different inputs, the text controller, the date picker, and then ultimately, actually, I don't think I talked about Inkwell. That's what creates a little splash when you touch something. It's a nice material effect, and dismissible to actually delete items. So, okay, this was a doozy, and I'm going to turn it back over to the whole team.
All right. Thank you very much, Craig. That was wonderful again. And man, that is a doozy. First, I'd like to bring up my co-host today, Sarah. She's from Google, and she's actually one of the guiding forces behind this whole thing. Hey, Sarah, welcome back.
Hi.
And we've got, we're always lucky enough that we've got a Ray Winderlich, who's the one that published this book. We have a team member that was involved in the book. And Stef, why don't you come back on and say hi again?
Hi.
And I'm going to bring Craig back up too, because he's our expert ready to answer questions for us.
Long time no see.
Absolutely. All right. That's our people. And Scott, do you have a question for us? All right. I'm sorry. Sarah's taking this segment. Go ahead.
Sure. Peter has asked, how do barrel files work? As they have exports and no imports. Is it worth implementing for a production grade app? Yes. But I think Stef has opinions on this. So.
Well, in the book, you'll see the barrel files that we have with the book. We put in export statements within those, and and then you use those as you're importing. There's also generated files that are also their examples, especially as you're moving along the book. And yes, I do agree that they are worth implementing on production grade apps.
Okay, and that's great. I just, since we've got Stef here, we're all human, as she was saying, and I was giving her a hard time about the fact that there actually are some problems in the book. However, I brought that up before we actually had a banner ready to go for it. So do we have that now? We can show for the errata. There we go.
Yes. So as Danielle said, and we all know that we're human and we all make mistakes. If you find something that you feel is a mistake, please go to that link and type it in, let us know, provide as much details as possible. Code samples are great. If you've got a Dart pad that has it in there, provide that as much information as possible. Then that way we can look into it and address it in a future edition.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Before we move on to the next question, I think Craig had a few more thoughts about barrel files.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out as everyone said, they just kind of forward along imports. So a barrel file will often be nothing but exports. And then by importing that file, you import everything that it exports. But one more detail that's worth noting is when you import package flutter /material.dart, that is a barrel file. Material.dart is just about 150 export statements. And I don't think there's anything else in material.dart. So, barrel files they should feel accessible to you. They're totally reasonable to use. They shorten the top of your file from being, maybe 50 import statements sometimes, could get it down to 10, 15, something like that. So I like them a lot.
Thanks, Craig. I like them too. Do we have any more questions? How do you recommend combining provider's consumer widget with a future builder below it? Are they going to interfere somehow?
So there's nothing intrinsic about those two things that will cause any conflict for, kind of first and foremost. If you have a consumer widget, it is, going to be able to watch something at the top level and then rebuild locally when when anything changes in what you're building. The same is true for a future builder. It kind of pays attention to a future and rebuilds locally when that future updates. And it's possible that you could have those watch the same thing and then lead to some sort of awkwardness there. But in general, Flutter is willing to draw a new frame 60 times per second. So even if those things are both triggering in like rapid succession, Flutter's not going to flicker if it draws the same thing again. It actually just reuses most of that UI. If, most of the pixels are the same, it just reuses that same information, those old calls to the GPU. And those two widgets should be able to coincide in pretty much any scenario.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really good question. We are about 3 minutes away from our usual endpoint, but we have a ton of good questions going in our queue. So we're just going to go over for 15, 20 minutes and try and answer as many as we can. And I hope you'll stick around. So do we have another good question? After reading up to chapter 6, why is the first challenge adding listeners to the scroll view? I'm still struggling to put widgets, i.e. a button, in the center of a new app without getting errors. Okay. It seems like a Stef question.
Yeah.
I was thinking the same thing. I was thinking it was a Stef question for sure.
Stef, explain yourself.
Tech editor, not author. So I can't answer the rationale as to why Vincent had that in the first challenge. But what I would recommend is go back through, because chapter 6, there's so much to it. If you get it on the first go 100%, you're my idol. But I recommend going back through 5 and 6 multiple times to make sure that you're grasping about widgets, advanced widgets. So then as you move along in the book, you're going to have an additional foundation that just reading it once you may have missed. As for adding the listeners to a scroll view, I am at a complaint blank right this second. Craig.
Well, conceptually, it's a thing that you can want to do. You may care about watching where the user scrolls. Maybe you have a fixed widget on the side that is going to kind of track where they scroll. Maybe you have like a little preview or something. And so the extra challenge there is to just kind of highlight that it's possible. If you're not aware of why you would care about that right now, then congratulations. You don't have to care about it right now. But it's a thing that you can do in Flutter. You can get an update every single pixel of scrolling that a user does. And, there are certain UI patterns that need that function. They need to be able to subscribe to those events in order to render the UI as imagined. But if that's not your UI, then you do not need to do that.
And I obviously can't speak toward the authors of the book, but I do know that one of the challenges that we always have when we're trying to educate and give stuff is, keeping it fresh. And so, it's a challenge. So, maybe that has something to do with it.
I can reach out to him and get additional confirmation, and I can look into it more. Please take that question and post it in the forums, and then that way we can have that interaction within the forums, and I'll make sure that we get the link to put back up on the forums there too.
Well, I think it's a bit of the spirit of Jay's question is just like, Flutter is still challenging for them.
Yes.
And this is like a really advanced thing. Like, what are you talking about? You expect me to be there, but I'm only here. Right. And, Jay, I learned Flutter over a long time, like took long Udemy courses, just, it's a new UI paradigm for a lot of folks, especially if you've not done React in the web. And if you're new to programming as well, you're new to mobile development, maybe the space of new concepts hitting you right now is enormous. And it's absolutely okay to feel like they're not all landing. I'm not keeping them all straight just yet. You will. And especially some of these extra adventures, kind of extra credit things at the end of chapters, like it's absolutely okay to worry about those later.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just like to add that in the chapter, there are links to additional resources that go into even more depth, because it's a lot and they can't cover everything in the chapters. So you might need to take the time to go down some rabbit holes on your own and just reinforce those concepts, because if this is your first time doing Flutter or programming, it's just, you need to practice and get it from different angles and use different resources. And I think Steph wanted to add something.
Yeah, so I can speak to that personally. I am a 20+ year SQL developer. So coming into Flutter was a big change for me. And I just had conversation last week with Simon. He's going through teaching me stuff. I've got lots of notes on it. But it's not always going to click, and you're not always going to get it. And that's okay. And it, especially like Craig said, if you're coming from another environment, I mean, SQL is by no means object-oriented. And so switching from that into this was a huge change. And thank you for pointing that out, Craig. I just wanted to make sure that it's okay to not get it. And you will get it. And
you'll get it the next time or the time after that.
Totally, exactly. Just keep going. Repetition is how humans learn. So keep going with it.
And okay, so I'm the host here. I give you permission. If you think this is above you right now, you can skip it and come back to it later. And before we get to the next question, I'd like to bring our producer, who's behind the stage, is doing stuff, back up on stage. And you jumped the gun.
Hello.
Hey, Scott.
Hello. I've been chasing a dog around the house while also trying to click the question. So, if the questions have been a little slow to come up, my apologies. All right. Looks like we have one for Steph here. Let's see. Go right ahead, Steph.
Sarah's our
Um,
question reader today.
Oh,
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Sure. Sorry. I was just like reading it for myself. Yes, interesting. I'm tired. I'm lost. Didn't understand 75% about this week's chapter and the stream. Going to read these chapters about 2 to 3 more times. Yes, I think we kind of addressed this just now, but if anyone else has anything to add, Danielle, for instance.
Yes, I want to say that this stuff is hard. Like was mentioned during the presentation. These are meaty. There's a lot of stuff to it. There's a lot of concepts here that we're adding on so that we can build a fully functional app. And I think every one of us here, the first time we were faced with provider or something like that, I don't think that we instantly got it. And there's parts of it, we're talking backstage a little bit that I still don't necessarily get. So I want to say it's thank you for trying it. Thank you for keeping going, and it will get there. I promise. And this is also a good time to talk about what to do if your question's not answered here, or if you come up with a follow-up question after we're done. And I'm not sure I'm going to remember all of these, but for sure, send a tweet out to the Flutter community. Join the Flutter, one of the Flutter Slacks or the Flutter Discord. As Steph has mentioned, there's a forum just for the book. You can do it. So there are lots of options. Come back for next update Q&A. There's lots of ways, and we all want to make sure that you get there because we're all passionate about Flutter and about helping all of you to learn stuff with it. So that's what we're at. And I think, Scott, maybe you want to add something to that?
Not so much to that. I mean, unless it is, other resources, as has been mentioned, is flutter.dev/community. Was all kind of great resources. And just do it. I mean, really, I hate to say it, but don't worry about getting it right, because it doesn't matter if you're getting paid a lot of money to do it. You're still going to get it wrong the first 9 times out of 10, and then it finally runs. You're in good company. I've seen Flutter team members. I've seen people who are paid ridiculous amounts of money. I've seen VGV members just muddle their way through and beat their heads on the desk for an hour until something runs. So don't feel bad.
I put a button in a button last night, and it literally took me an hour to figure out why. So, I mean, it's the fact that
Scaffold
everything's
in a scaffold.
Oh yeah,
double
been
lap
there.
bar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So don't worry, you'll get there.
You'll get
Oh,
there,
yeah.
and it's easier than a lot of alternatives, but it's definitely there. And Scott, if I could have you put your producer hat on just for a second, can you show the link that we've got there ready to go?
The link for which I've been doing
it's
a
in
lot
the
of
forums to show the
private chat.
forums.
Sorry, the forums.
Yeah.
How about
okay.
I do the link and Scott can bring up the next question.
All right. In which case, I'll read
Let me
it.
see here. First of all, I will drop this into the YouTube chat.
There you go.
And then
You just
let's
share it.
create a new banner.
That's a great way to do it. That's way to think.
Yep.
Absolutely.
There you go. Whoops.
Okay.
Seamless. Always seamless.
So
This is what happens when more than one person has the controls.
it's live TV, folks.
Yep.
HTTPS. Yeah, exactly right there. You got the link to do it. That's the forums. That's really what I meant to say there. And that's another place that you can go, especially about questions about the book. But I bet they would answer just about any Flutter question you had. You'd have a lot of people there. But for sure, if you have questions on the book, that's a great place to go.
Yeah, and there's also not just for the book, but within the forums at raywinderlight.com, there is Flutter channels that you can also ask questions about articles and the book, various things like that. So we're here to help.
Alrighty. Let's see here. I happen to notice one that is kind of near and dear to my heart. Let's see. Sarah, if you don't mind.
Yes, Roberto, again, had a lot of good questions. I have a couple of widgets which I would like to make scrollable. What is the difference between single child scroll view and list view? Not builder, since I know it creates widgets dynamically. Well, I think Scott had opinions on this.
Yeah, it's what it really comes down to. There are times when you read the class names and other things, and they don't always help a lot, such as if you are looking at the flex, which can have a flexible, which the flexible has a parameter called a flex. You'll drive, don't. I do a whole talk on that one. I do a whole talk on it. But in this case, it's a little easier to handle. The single child scroll view has one widget as a child. It will scroll that child because that child is too big to fit in your page size. Whereas the list view builder takes a list of multiple children that are usually smaller than your screen size, but they don't have to be. And it will scroll all of them, the whole list of widgets. So the single child scroll view, there can only be one, if you've ever heard of Highlander. If not, I'm showing my age. But the list view, you have a list of stuff. The single child, you've got one. But clearly it's going to be bigger than the available space. Now, another thing, you don't need to use a single child scroll view for the whole size of the screen. You could divide your screen
Danielle.
into a couple of columns.
Sorry, Scott.
And split. Okay, Danielle. you can take a column and put a couple of single child scroll views in it and be scrolling more than one thing. And another fun thing to do that I have done is you take like a row and you put a number of single child scroll views in it with other rows or columns or even list views, because then you can scroll it left to right and there's a whole bunch of columns and you can make yourself a slot machine.
Nice.
Which is pretty cute.
That is cute.
So, all right. Anybody else on this?
That was a little bit of an inside joke for people. If you haven't seen Highlander, if you have seen it, the sword thing is kind of funny. But anyway,
and if you haven't,
Danielle was going. Okay, I'm sorry, I missed that.
Oh, I held a sword up. Anyway, I don't have a katana. So anyway, the difference in a lot of cases here, real simple, is normally the normal use for a single child scroll view would be to have like a column inside of it. If you just have a column, you can throw that in there. A list is, that's at least how I had learned on that. When I did a list view with a bunch of things that would have fit just fine in a column. If you are doing things where maybe you're lining stuff up separately or things like that, where a column's not appropriate, then a list view works very well. And obviously, if you're using a builder or using any of the fancy stuff like that, then of course you would want to use a list view. But if all you're doing is all you do is basically have a column and you want to be scrollable, you can throw that into a single child scroll view. And that's not going to break if the column wouldn't scroll. So you can use that to help protect. You can use that to help protect. A lot of times when you would want to do that is if you're not sure that the height, for example, in the case of a column, is going to fit within whatever device they have, because they may have different devices. You can make sure you're safe by putting in a single child scroll view, as long as obviously scrolling is okay.
Absolutely.
Next,
Excellent
we have
advice.
I'm sorry.
I said excellent advice.
Yes, it is. Next, we
And
have
comedy.
another one from Luis Carlos Rodriguez.
What does a question mark next to a variable mean?
And if you've heard this one a bunch of times, folks, please remember this is, we're trying to get people used to a bunch of things, and they may not have heard it before.
Yeah.
So who wants to field this one?
Looks like Danielle has.
All right.
has
There's a couple of things you can do it. And I saw a version of this question earlier that also talked about with types. And so this all has to do with nullable, if I'm understanding the question correctly. So if the type has a question mark on it, it means it's either, for example, a string or it's null. And that's a distinct value. And that's used in null safety, which you may hear about. If you have a class that could be null, you can't just access the members of that class. And so if you do a question mark, like question mark dot, the name of the method, then what you end up with is it may be null. If the top part's null, then the answer is going to be null. Otherwise, you will get whatever that variable was. And so it has to do with null safety. And it's very useful because null safety in Dart is amazing.
Yes.
All right. I don't know if there's anything more to add on that one.
That was a good explanation. Yeah.
Yep. So let's see here. This one is something to do with provider. Zara?
Could you share some cases that we should set listener false to in provider? Scott, you seem to have thoughts?
Listener false mainly is literally when you don't want it to listen. So when would that happen? Okay, no, I mean, seriously, now let's think about when would that happen? Because you're using your provider not just to get data from the provider, but also to trigger functions in it. Okay, don't forget that part. It does go both ways. Now, if you have a button and you're going to be triggering a function in the provider, and your button's text or your button's child, icon, color, whatever, does not depend on anything from that provider, such as it's not set by a value in the provider, then why would your button listen to it? Really, why? So if you can't think of an answer, set listen to false. Danielle, anything to add on that one?
Yeah. First off, maybe for some of our people, understanding what listening actually means is provider under the covers is implementing change notifier, which is a way so that a parent widget can get a message to the child widget, and the message literally is "I've changed. You may want to go check stuff." And so by doing that's what normally would happen. And sometimes you don't need to listen, in which case you don't want to redraw based upon something changing when you don't really care about that. The other time is sometimes you're in a place where you can't change in the middle of it. So for example, if you're in your init state of a stateful widget and something causes that to change there, that will break things if you're listening, because you try to rebuild while you're rebuilding or while you're building. And so that's a case of where you need to have listener false.
It's an excellent question.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. And another one that is related that I seem to have lost. We've got a lot of stuff going on in chat here. Let me see here. There we go.
Peter is wondering about consumer. When would we use that third parameter child in a builder? Craig?
Yeah, so I glossed over that in the talk, but thanks for bringing us back to it. The what that parameter does, imagine your builder wraps a large part of your UI, and that UI does not change in many ways. It does not depend on the provider, the change notifier in any way, but you need to wrap that part of your UI in like something else. So maybe you want to wrap your UI in like that dismissibility, or you want just some other kind of dressing on a part of your UI. And it's that dressing that does depend on the consumer. You can pass the inner part of your UI that does not change as a child to the consumer widget, and then it reappears for you in the builder method, and then you can use it again in what you return. And what that does is prevent any of that content from being pointlessly recomputed, relaid out, and re-rendered every frame. So that's a great question. And without having code up, it is maybe a little challenging to follow what I just said. But if a significant chunk of your UI doesn't actually, like below what cares about the provider, there's more stuff deeper in your UI that doesn't care. You can prepare that ahead of time, pass it to the consumer as a child. It reappears in the builder method. You plop it in whatever widgets you return, and it will basically be cached. Hopefully that made some sense.
I know Animation Builder has a child also, so it's not just in consumer there.
Yeah, that's a great point. Handful of widgets have that pattern.
Yeah, value listenable builder as well. There is a slightly different way I phrase the same thing. Basically, let's say you have a page and the page has a background that's blue. Now that is being determined by the value in a provider. So the consumer is getting that value and it's making the background blue. On this blue background, you have 20,000 widgets, okay, inside of one container. Question: if the background changes from blue to red, do you want to rebuild 20,000 widgets? No. So you make that container a child in the builder. And what happens is when the provider changes, it pulls that out and sets it aside, changes your background, and then the child just gets dropped right back in without being rebuilt. Craig, that kind of sound sort of maybe?
Well, that sounded to me like a good rephrasing. Hopefully between those two that helped, but that's a great question.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
We have had a lot of good questions today. We've had so many good questions that we don't have time to go through them all. I think we're going to take one more.
Mm-hmm. And I think this one's very, very important for intermediate and beginner Flutter developers. Advanced should already know this because they should have already messed it up.
Well, I mess up everything, so.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Kristen. Why do you need to dispose of a controller?
Memory leak.
Yeah, that's basically it. But if Danielle, do you want to expand?
Well, no, it's because it's a memory leak, and over time your app would have responsiveness issues, and then eventually die. So that's why you have to do that, because if it runs out of memory, it's a bad thing. But also because Lint will complain if you don't.
Yeah.
Yes.
Of course,
So
who cares about the memory leak?
An interesting point, though, that's also related to this. How do I put this? Okay. When you do a init state, it's initializing from the top down. And when you navigate away, when it's destroying that widget, it's destroying things from the bottom up, from the init state. So you have to be careful to make sure the super is the top call, because the super is, remember, the parent class, and it contains a lot of the foundation that everything else is built on. So call the super first, then anything else in init state. And then when everything is wrapped up, as you navigate away, it will get rid of everything in ascending order. So it gets rid of super last. So that's another Simon.
I probably want to clarify with what you're saying. It's not that it gets rid of it last. It's when you're doing your dispose and you're putting the dispose of the thing in there, it's probably appropriate to dispose the controller before you call super dispose.
Yes.
So
and I believe that was
in dispose, yes, but also init state is kind of a similar thing.
Init state goes the one direction, like you explained. I'm just pointing out the fact that when you're disposing, you can go the other direction.
Yeah, and super should be last.
And Craig?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, no, nothing to add. That's complete.
Do it in the wrong direction, you'll figure it out.
No, it's like forgetting your keys and trying to drive home. Like you can't get far. Yeah. You'll quickly realize.
That's whatever I can't forget. I put my keys with. Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. To give you an idea how many questions there have been, folks, and we love the engagement. I've been going down here. Randall Schwartz has been out there. He's actually putting questions in a spreadsheet.
Thank you, Randall.
For us. Thank you, Randall. So, hey, GDE people, he may not be on camera. He's contributing. So put that down in his sheet. Long story. You don't want to know, people. Anyway, we have only made it down to the 46 minutes after the past hour mark. In other words, the questions that we just answered were asked, 40 minutes
45.
ago.
So what are we going to do with the extra
45 minutes
questions?
ago. So the extra questions that we cannot get to right now, please put them in Twitter with hashtag. What is the hashtag?
Flutter
Flutter
Apprentice.
Flutter
Flutter
Apprentice.
Apprentice.
So
Also,
yes,
all of
It's
the
an easy one.
resources that I shared at the beginning, and we will put in the show description immediately after we're done live streaming.
yes.
So,
If they're specific to the book, go to the forums.
yes, do that.
All right. And I think that about does it. So I want to thank all of my on-camera people. I want to thank Randall. I want to thank Scott for producing most of it, but he's on camera right now, so he qualifies both. So he gets 2 thank yous. And Flutter community for hosting this for us, and Ray Wenderlich for a great book and the deal with Google, and I guess I'd keep going around the room. Google for creating such a great project.
Yeah.
For product.
And
Thank you,
please
Craig,
consider
for
supporting Flutter community. I'm sorry, sir.
I was going to say thank you, Craig, for presenting the material in a palatable way that people can enjoy
Yes.
as well.
Well, it's been a
So-
blast.
And just a reminder, the book is free until January 6th on the Ray Wenderlich link. So if you just happen to stick around for Hump Day Q&A, or you were here for Hump Day Q&A, but stuck around for this and you haven't read the book, it's free right now.
All
Although
right. And with that,
Steph is one of the people involved that I think she gets a piece when they sell them. She gives you permission to buy. She gives you
Yes.
permission to buy the book anyway.
Absolutely. You're
You
more
have
than welcome
permission.
to buy. You have permission.
okay, and with that,
Craig,
we
did you
have
have
been going
anything?
almost 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
I mean, unless somebody's got something else to add.
I thought, nope, no one else? Okay. I thought Craig did. All right.
I'm good.
All good.
Okay,
good.
already another short stream.
Thank you for
And
coming.
we
I
will
hope we'll see you next week.
See you
See
next
you
week.
Bye.
Oh, once again, it probably goes without saying, but what are we covering next week? What
Flutter
chapter should they be
Apprentice
reading?
book.
Navigation.
What chapter should we be reading?
Navigation.
7
Oh,
and
yes.
8, yeah.
7 and 8. You're going to learn all about deep linking and how to handle web URLs and Navigator 2.0. It's going to be very exciting.
All right,
And
great.
you
So
want
we're
to
on
do
okay to
chapter 7 and 8.
before coming here.
Yeah.
So, or at least try it so you're familiar with what we're talking about. It's always good to have at least half an idea of what we're talking about. It's usually about all we have.
But most importantly, be here. So
All right. See you, everyone.
be there.
See ya.
Bye.